Hello, good morning. This is Hildegard Meiner. You are on thatchannel.com. Today is the 12th of February 2016, only 2 days till Valentine's Day. And it's my privilege to introduce you to a subject you might not ever have heard of. It's called New German Medicine. And my guest today is Isidora Laker, who is a first-generation consultant in the field of New German Medicine. Welcome, Isidora. Thank you for being here with us.
My pleasure.
Isidora, I understand you haven't been involved in natural health or medicine all your life. You actually were a singer before.
Yes, I was an aspiring opera singer, and I did have a career. I gave my last performance in 1998, my last solo performance. But because there was a great interest in my family in natural medicine, my mother was healed through natural medicine. She was written off by conventional medicine, so we learned to respect this field. So my husband and I, in 1978, began to study natural medicine together. And he's continued in his particular field, but I sort of strayed as we went along. Although I still had my career in music, I still managed the business and, kept up my studies. But in 1992, I was presented with a recording. Everybody was giving out these 30-minute tapes or whatever. This was a 3-hour recording of a lecture that Dr. Ricke Gerd-Hamer gave in 1979 in Innsbruck. And of course, I'm German-speaking, so for me, it was easy to understand. And I was given the tape in '92 and put it on a pile of other tapes. Ignored it until the lady that gave it to me said, I'm interested in his books. I'd like your opinion. So I popped the tape in the car as I was driving home. Our business was on Yonge Street in Willowdale, and we lived in Ajax. So I listened to it for the first time about 6 or 8 months after it was given to me. And that was a life-altering moment. Because
so Dr. Hammer had given a lecture in Innsbruck, in
Yes.
Austria,
Yes.
and you were given these tapes,
In
and they
Canada.
sat around in a corner in your house forever.
Exactly.
So talk about when the student is ready, only then.
You're not kidding.
Well, you're awake.
Yeah.
So what was the tape about?
Well, it was really just an introduction to his discovery, which was called the New Medicine at that time, and he officially discovered this in 1981. The experience that led to this discovery was 3 years prior, in 1978, and that had to do with the shooting death of his son Dirk. And this was quite an event. It was it's part of the European royal family history, because it was the Italian Crown Prince Victor Emmanuel that was responsible for the shooting.
What reason did he have to shoot him? Had that something to do with his father branching out of medicine, or?
Oh, no. Dr. Hammer was a traditional medical doctor at that time. Yes. He was actually the youngest doctor to ever graduate from medical school in Germany. He had a thriving practice. He had invented a lot of surgical instruments and was doing very well with royalties from his inventions. His wife was a medical doctor. His mother is Italian, so he was living in Italy at the time. Thriving practice, traditional medical practice.
In Italy and in Germany?
No, just Italy.
Just Italy.
At that time.
Okay.
And at that time, his children were teenagers growing up, and his son was on a school trip with other children around his age to the Isle of Corsica. And this is when he was accidentally shot by the Italian Crown Prince. Now, it's a long, involved story. There's a lot of information out there that is correct, but a lot of it is incorrect. But the long and short of it is that Dr. Hammer held the Italian Crown Prince responsible for the shooting death of his son, regardless of what the issue was around it. There were 3 trials. He was actually convicted the first 2 trials. By the time of the 3rd trial, which was 9 years later, this is when a lot of the evidence disappeared and he was exonerated, so for lack of evidence. But if you do a search on Victor Emmanuel of the House of Savoy, you'll see his personal history, and that it is very, very controversial.
Now, I understand that after the loss of his son, this medical doctor who's done those wonderful things got sick himself. Please tell us what happened.
Yes, his son died after 3 months, and countless surgeries, and he died in Dr. Hammer's arms. Of course, this was a very traumatic event for both he and his wife. And 3 months later, Dr. Hammer was diagnosed with a testicular teratoma. And being a traditional medical doctor, he decided on surgery, but he declined chemotherapy. It was against his belief system at that time.
So they removed the tumor,
Yes.
and then he didn't want to do chemo afterwards.
Exactly,
Okay.
yes. And you know, when I first met him in '99, I asked him about that because I knew his background was traditional. And he said, you know, Isadora, this is directly from the horse's mouth. He said, I don't know any medical doctors that would subject themselves or their family to that kind of treatment. And I was really very astonished.
But somehow, did he not work in a cancer hospital in
Well,
Munich
he
at
was
some point?
he
Or
was
was that later?
No, he was the head internist when he discovered this, or when he put the pieces together. He was the head internist of a oncology clinic that specialized in reproductive cancers that was associated with the University of Munich.
So both testicular and ovarian cancer?
Yes, yes. I imagine uterine and cervical cancers were also part of that.
Okay.
But he was in charge of 180 patients. So when he developed this himself, he began to question the fact that this was in such close proximity to the diagnosis of his cancer, this horrible event in his life. Subsequently, his wife developed breast cancer, which is also connected. But when he began to question all of his patients that he was in charge of, this is when he discovered that all the patients that had testicular cancers all had the same kind of conflict. The same with ovarian cancers, the same with all cancers. So his initial research was actually in cancer, but now it encompasses all diseases outside of poisoning.
So correct me if I'm wrong. So are you saying all illness has an emotional component
Absolutely.
and the root of it all?
Yes. It's not, we can't really call it emotional. It has to be a moment in time that you didn't expect to happen. And this is the cornerstone, actually, of what Dr. Hammer discovered. It has to be what we call an unanticipated event.
Okay, so but it has some sort of a shock on you.
Absolutely,
It's
yes.
not an unexpected, joyful event.
Oh, no.
It
That's
is
a resolution.
trauma, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So then how did he come to deal with this? So now he knows people have cancer. There is some unexpected event that underlies the occurrence of cancer, like in his own life, his
Yes.
son being shot.
Yes, but that was just the beginning. From there on, believe it or not, he had a series of dreams that involved his son Dirk coming to him and leading him to certain areas that he was meant to research. And from there he discovered the second biological law. The first biological law is what he calls the iron rule of cancer, which is really this moment of the unanticipated event.
Right.
From there on, depending exactly on how you perceived that event or how it was experienced, from then on, it was literally pre-programmed or predetermined as to what part of the brain and what organ was going to be simultaneously affected. So with that first biological law, he actually understood that in a split second, there were 3 areas or 3 levels that were affected: the psyche, the brain, and the organ. And from there, he began to look at the disease process. He found that there were some diseases that developed during the conflict active phase, and surprisingly, there were some diseases that would only develop when the conflict was resolved.
Okay, so there's a conflict, but I'm not getting sick only when it's over.
Exactly.
So people don't get ill when they divorce or lose their business or lose a loved one.
They
It's-
get ill when it's resolved. And this is part of the healing process, because the damage that is done on the organ during those processes, it is on a microscopic level. And all we have are the symptoms of stress.
Okay.
A good example that I think everybody can identify is you go on holiday and you get sick with a cold or a flu. It's the moment you let go that the body
Yeah, you don't
responds.
push yourself to get out in the morning and feed the children and go to work, and
Yeah.
you kind of chill, and that's when we get ill.
Yes. Or you're removed from the conflict. You know?
So now, how did he discover that? Because in some of the material you shared with me earlier, there is a scientific way of actually proving,
Yes.
there is this traumatic event, and the brain. He recognized this in the brain scans. Then,
Yes.
did he?
Well, you know, I consider Dr. Hammer to be a genius, and he has this wealth of knowledge. He was not only studying medicine, he also studied physics, and he also studied religions. He has his doctorate in theology, so he was well versed in all areas. You know, his first book was called Cancer, Disease of the Soul.
Makes sense to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, but he equates the psyche with the soul.
Mm-hmm.
But he also understood that we are biological creatures, and we had to understand how the soul affected the biological creature.
And yet, how many universities and high schools and kindergarten and in families is the soul discussed today?
Yet,
We'll talk about the
Nowhere.
hardware there's the hardware of the computer and the software that
Yes.
animates it, but we really don't see our soul
no,
as a driving force behind the physical vessel. We put all the attention here, right?
exactly. We are dissected right down to the DNA now. Yes, we're no longer seen as a whole.
Okay, so this was the first biological law. You said there are 5?
Yes. From there, he discovered that there are 2 phases to every disease. We have a stress phase, and there are 2 things that can happen to that stress phase. Either we can develop a functional disturbance, such as a diabetes or an MS, or we could develop a kind of cancer. And these cancers are specifically known as adenocarcinomas. They're glandular in origin. Now, he began to look at embryology and evolution of the cells and evolution of the human being. And this is when he was able to actually put together the mechanism that existed within the brain that would determine whether or not we would have a disease process during the conflict active phase, or whether we would have a disease process which is actually a healing phase when the conflict is resolved. And this is the most difficult thing that most people
So
have to grasp with
firstly,
this.
I'm stressed out about something that could lead me to have a diabetes issue or a thyroid problem or adrenal exhaustion or something like that.
Well, the thyroid problems, hyperactive thyroid would develop during the conflict active phase.
So
but
that would be stress symptom then?
Yes, but you see, we also have another component to the thyroid on a cellular level. We have a different cellular structure that would degenerate the tissue during the conflict activity and present itself with a thyroid nodule, a papillary thyroid carcinoma, or which would eventually become a cold nodule, depending on when you're diagnosed. So when he began to realize that all organs had different cellular structures, this is also when he understood that different areas of the brain control different cellular structures, and that would determine whether or not they would degenerate during the conflict activity or create a tissue plus, in other words, a tumor or a nodule.
So tell us about the pictures in the brain.
Okay.
What happens actually in the brain?
You know, this is something that Dr. Hammer came across very early on in his travels. 1981, he had this position as head internist. So he started his research on the quiet a little bit, but, you know, there was a rumbling They terminated his contract when they understood the direction of his research a couple of years later. But he was still a doctor that was responsible for emergency admissions. Mm-hmm. And one day there was a patient that was wheeled into Emerge who had had an apparent heart attack. He was unconscious. Under those situations, of course, what they do is they do a CAT scan of the brain. They have to see if there's something else that is causing the unconsciousness. So when they did a CAT scan of the brain and Dr. Hammer looked at it, he saw that there was a pocket of fluid that was precisely on the part of the brain that neurology understood was the heart rhythm center. And this is when he realized that the brain actually mediated what went on between the psyche and the organ. And from there on, I mean, he couldn't get enough CTs to justify his research and to verify all of his findings.
So the CAT scan shows what's happening in the body, and based on the part of the brain that lights up, let's just call it that, he could determine which part of the body is affected and then determine the basic trauma?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. But this was only the beginning. It was the tip of the iceberg. He still had to understand how the brain and what parts of the brain controlled what organs and what cellular structure.
Well, that was my next question. How do you know which part of the brain is in charge of what?
Well, just by observation and research. And of course, he's what he calls an empirical researcher. He will not make any hypothesis. This has to be proven over again and again and again in each next best case. So, for example, in all cases of thyroid cancer, we would see the same location in the brain always being affected. Okay? Ovarian cancers, lung cancers, you name it, always the same location.
Now, you mentioned earlier certain parts of the brain, and we took some scans earlier of the different sections of the brain. So there's 4 parts of the brain, but they make 3 different cells?
Yes.
Could you elaborate a bit on that?
There are actually 3 embryonic germ layers, and they are literally developed the moment that the ovum is fertilized. This is when our embryo that becomes the fetus is formed. So all of our organs are literally formed from those 3 germ layers. And, of course, the CNS, the central nervous system, is also developed at that stage of our
So the woman is barely pregnant, and the brain develops in the first little while?
Yes, in the first trimester, all of this is set into motion.
Okay.
So when we have a pregnancy, this is literally evolution in progress. We can observe how our bodies evolved from what Dr. Hammer believes to be a single ring-formed creature that swam at the bottom of the ocean. So as we evolved, these germ layers also evolved. For example, when we came onto the land, we had to develop a mechanism where we would survive the elements. This is when our dermis was developed, and this offered us protection. So the dermis and all diseases to do with the dermis or that particular cell layer has to do with trying to protect us from something. Mm-hmm. Okay, so all of the biological programs that we respond to now are actually part of our evolutionary progress as well. These are programs that are meant to help us to survive these circumstances that we could find threatening. Mm-hmm. So they're all biological occurrences that are very, very meaningful to our survival.
So there's a part that makes the skin cells then?
Absolutely, yes. There's a part of the brain that controls all of the glands or the tissues derived from the glands. Mm-hmm. There's a part of the brain that controls our skin, the deeper layer of the skin, because we have 2 skins. And there is a germ layer that controls all of our connective tissue, the lymphatic system, our muscles, our striated muscles, the bones. They're all controlled by a different area of the brain. And then we have the tubes and the outer skin, the tubes of the organs that transport either enzymes or digestive secretions, or even facilitate the discharge of fluids, such as the kidneys.
Well, I had assumed cell is cell. The body makes cell, and that's it. And they're all the same, but they're not.
But you see, even in oncology, they differentiate what kind of cellular structure the cancer is made of. So they somehow sensed that they were not all the same cells that were reacting.
Right. So then the CAT scan narrows down where the problem is. Dr. Hammer discovered that different parts of the brain are in charge of what. So now he knows, he has a cancer patient, he knows something is happening in a specific part of the body. Then what? What does he do? Tradition being you remove the tumor,
right.
You do the chemotherapy, and he didn't want to do that. What did he then do different after that?
Well, through his observations, he realized that cells that grew during the conflict active phase actually stopped growing when the conflict was resolved. And from there on, one of two things would happen. Either they were degraded by microbes that already existed in our body, or it would remain dormant if we had eradicated those microbes through antibiotics.
Wow.
For example, tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is the healing phase of a lung cancer, a pulmonary nodule. So this is the end stage of the decomposition of a tumor that developed as a result of a fear of death conflict.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So a person is afraid to die. I mean, people have gone through wars, they have gone through personal traumas. So people are scared to die, and it shows up as, oh my God, I can't breathe.
Well, you're partially correct there, because our innate response in a fight or flight moment that is highly threatening to our lives is to take in air.
Oh yeah, and we are breathing from up
Yes.
here. We are not relaxed breathing from
Exactly.
the belly, right?
Yes. So in order for us to survive, the lung alveoli, they multiply. The cells multiply, and this facilitates a better intake of oxygen during the conflict active phase.
Makes sense. And I'm working hard to fight or to run away, right?
Right. So there you have the biological meaning of this physical occurrence that we call disease. We only call it disease because it's been misunderstood.
So then the stress is over, and that's when degeneration happens even more.
Yes, yes. And this is when we need to be careful. Because if we are looking at someone that is suffering from a tuberculosis, that in itself has physical repercussions, especially if they are weak already from high stress, if they are emaciated, if they don't have access to good nutrition, as it was post-World War I, right, which was when we had the greatest tuberculosis epidemic in the Western world, right? Within a couple of years, we had this huge epidemic of tuberculosis. Now, what's very interesting about lung tumors is that Dr. Hammer found that if we have a fear of death for oneself, for example, if we have a diagnosis of a serious illness and we feel that we're not going to recover, then we develop multiple pulmonary nodules. And they're usually, millimeters dispersed throughout both lungs.
So even when my doctor tells me this is what shows up on the X-ray or the ultrasound, that message itself could cause trauma?
Absolutely. Remember, it's a shock that creates the physical repercussions, that sets this biological program into motion. Consider a cancer patient is experiencing a shock on the diagnosis. And it's how they perceive that shock that is going to determine where the next cancer process is going to go. They are, at that moment, in fear for their lives. They may not develop a lung cancer immediately, but down the line, if treatment doesn't work, if the prognosis is very negative, if they have another recurrence of it, then this is when they will develop, usually as the last stage of a cancer development, the lungs.
So staying with the lung cancer, We now know, or Dr. Hammer now knew,
Yes.
the person feared for his life. How do you overcome that now? The body has this cancer. He now has his understanding. What's the next step to then eliminate that fear of death so the body hopefully can recover, or what needs to happen for it to recover?
Well, this is something that I had to learn in my studies and in my experience with my clients. How do we go about resolving something or making sure that it is resolved? First, we have Dr. Hammer's very clear research as to what kind of conflict we're going to be looking for. So the entire process really involves the precise identification of the conflict, how you experience that conflict at that very moment, and how long you experienced it. Okay, because if you experience, for example, a fear of death conflict, it's going to take at least 6 to 8 weeks before there's going to be anything visible on an X-ray, right? From there on, it may already have stopped growing. It may already be in resolution.
But how am I aware that this is what's happening inside of me?
Well, only through traditional
So is it psychotherapy then that you do?
You know, I've often wondered about that. There is really no psychotherapy involved. It's really about the identification of the exact moment in time that you experienced that shock and how it was perceived by you. Now, at that moment, there are literally billions of bits of information that are going through our psyche, right? So, because our brains are made that way, we perceive our entire surroundings. So if, for example, at that moment you were eating an orange, in that moment of shock or trauma, potentially that orange is going to be a track or a trigger back into conflict. So this is the associations that we will make.
So I could be allergic to oranges from there on forth?
Absolutely. You will get a reaction to the orange depending on how you perceived that particular shock. For example, if you had a separation while you were eating an orange or drinking orange juice, the next time that you would be eating an orange, you would develop a skin condition. It's that precise.
So a child hearing people in their house argue about potentially divorcing while they're having their breakfast and there's some oranges that they just took, that could be the trigger and later on develop in something.
Into a sensitivity. That's what food sensitivities and allergies are really all about. They're associated with a moment in our lives when we had a shock, when something happened that we didn't want to experience.
Well, this is growing so rampant in our society now.
Yes.
I mean, there's barely anybody who doesn't have any sensitivity to anything.
Yes.
So would that be related to the soul
Well, we are bombarded.
trying to get our attention? Or?
City dwellers, we are constantly bombarded with information, with negative information. In the workplace, television, movies, there's so much violence. It's shocking. It really is shocking. So I'm not surprised that allergies are really that rampant in our society these days.
Now, what I'm not clear on yet, and you might have said it, but it's such a new thing for me. I may not have been hearing you. So we now know the person has a fear of death. There is evidence in the liver something isn't okay. Now Dr. Hammer knows what the underlying issue is. How does he now facilitate that this healing process occurs so that the person can regain health without chemical interference?
Well, you know, the best example I think I could give is really the TB mycobacteria and how they degrade these tumors once we go into a healing phase. Now, I began to mention, before I got off track, I began to mention that multiple lung nodules indicate fear of death for self, right? A single lung nodule indicates fear of death for a loved one. So, and this helps to confirm what the TB epidemic was really all about after World War I. It was because the general population was in fear of death for their loved one.
Yeah.
Now, we know that some people survived and other people didn't. So we have to look at why some survived, because they weren't diagnosed with a cancer. They were diagnosed with a tuberculosis, which could only have been there if it was preceded by a cancer. So that meant that the TB was part of the healing phase to eat up the tissue that developed during the conflict active phase. And eventually, once that runs its course, all you will see is a scar in the lung. Traditional medicine acknowledges this. They just don't realize that a cancer preceded it.
Maybe what needs to happen is you're explaining to us, please, the process of healing, because it appears that what I look as a disease is actually only the final stage of me getting better.
Yes.
Of something that's
Yes.
underneath.
Well, the process of healing actually involves, again, two parts of a phase. So if we look at Dr. Hammer's graph, the law of two phases, where he has first the shock, then we go into the stress phase, and from the stress phase, when we resolve the conflict, we go into what we call the first half of the healing phase. And when you look at the graph that Dr. Hammer has developed, you see that there is a dip that we go into. This is when we have most of the physical symptoms that we call illness. Most people don't realize that they have a lung cancer until they develop the symptoms, like the cough, right? So this will take a period of time to degrade, to decompose. So it's in the first half of the healing phase that you will see the microbial activity. But that also will run its course. And from there, we go into what we call the healing crisis, or the epileptoid crisis. So this is a spike that separates the healing phase. This is, in many diseases, a moment of truth, because it could be fatal depending on what had happened to you. Now, in the case of a lung cancer, it's not fatal. It's just the turning point. It's the turnaround from the active tuberculosis decomposition phase to the point where your body begins to recover from that. And you go into the second half of the healing phase, again going through a dip. But then once you're through that second half, everything goes back to normal.
So when Dr. Hammer was dealing with his cancer patients, he analyzed what this problem was in the body, and then was there like an interaction between him and the patient to
Of
explain
course.
to them?
Yes.
And in the understanding of this, is there healing
Absolutely.
occurring right there? Or did he need to
can.
do something else?
No, it can occur at that moment. You can facilitate a turnaround and turning off that switch of activity right there and then, the moment the patient understands when it was set into motion.
So awareness of something that I didn't have awareness before 5 minutes ago has a biochemical, brings about a
Yes.
biochemical shift.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So he didn't, like I was assuming initially that he was taking the people into some psychotherapy and some
Not at all.
hypnosis and some this and some that.
It isn't. It's not about psychotherapy. That's the extraordinary thing about it.
So the fact that the patient becomes aware that you have heart disease and that it's a territorial issue, knowing that in itself changes everything.
No. You have to it's not just knowing that it's a territorial issue. You have to understand it within the context of your own experience.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's stay with the lung disease.
Yes.
So somebody was afraid for their son or some loved one, the husband, dying in the war,
Yeah.
and they developed the illness in the lung. So now they come across Dr. Hammer, understand this. Now what happens? What then needs to happen?
Oh, you mean if they
for the
just,
healing process?
if they were
to-
diagnosed with a single round lung nodule?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, like I said, when we have a DHS or a shock, then there are billions of bits of information and tracks are formed at that moment. So we have to understand also to get the person out of this situation, because they could be looping or remain in the conflict active phase, even though the conflict may be resolved, just based on tracks or external triggers.
Yeah, so let's just
Okay.
clarify what DHS means. People don't have a reference for that, please, if you would.
DHS stands for Dirk-Hammer syndrome.
Okay.
And this is in honor of his son. It defines the moment of the shock, which is what Dr. Hammer experienced when his son was shot, when he was mortally wounded.
Okay.
So that was his shock.
Okay, so then he
Okay.
identified for himself that.
Yes, so in honor of Dirk, he calls it Dirk-Hammer syndrome,
This is the
DHS.
moment in time when this
Yes.
developed, this
Yes.
illness.
So those of us in the GNM, we refer to this as a DHS, that moment of shock.
Okay.
So we have to identify all the tracks and possible triggers and try to understand why the person is not recovering from this, even though the conflict may be solved.
And where does that show up? Then again in the brain? Will Dr.
Yes.
Hammer go there, back to his CAT scan and see what it says there?
Absolutely, and this is the extraordinary thing. Over the course of his initial research, he discovered that once he realized what he was looking for and what he was seeing, that just by the way it looked in the brain, he could identify whether or not the conflict was active or whether or not the conflict was resolved.
So on the CAT scan, there's like different
We can
images?
we can see our entire medical history on the CAT scan of the brain. And this is really what convinced me initially. After I was exposed to Dr. Hammer's research in 92, you know the law of attraction, and when you
Right.
really want to know something, how it
When
it
the
came to
student
me.
is ready, it shows up. I guess
It-
that's why you and I met.
Exactly. It came to me. I was put into direct contact with a protege of Dr. Hammer. And I was so vocal about this research, and the community in Toronto is relatively small. They started hearing about me talking about Dr. Hammer, and all of a sudden I was presented with a protege of Dr. Hammer's, a medical doctor who spoke English. At that time, I didn't know that Dr. Hammer also spoke some English.
Right.
But I invited him to give some seminars here initially, and he gave me a very good, solid introduction to the research. And at that time, I also had the opportunity to get a CAT scan of my brain. So I gave him the CT of my brain. We sat down after a lovely lunch, wasn't liquid, and he.
I was just
thank you.
watching.
Cheers. And he proceeded to tell me my entire medical history, from the fact that I had a nodule in my breast, and that I had also a large melanoma on my back, and that's very convincing. But he looked at me. He's wondering, how is she going to take this with me telling her this? And I just smiled and I said, "Oh, that is so wonderful. It confirms everything." And I said, "It's in the healing phase, right?" And he says, "Oh, yes, absolutely." I had already gone through a self-assessment based on what I had already learned from Dr. Hammer's research. So I knew I was in a healing phase. I knew I wasn't in danger. And that was my survival.
Well, you're giving a lot of hope, hopefully, to a lot of people who are viewing this now or later. And I'm just wondering, could you elaborate a little bit on how you are working with people? Are you actively seeing clients right now? Or I know you do a lot of
Yes.
teaching and lecturing.
Yes.
Could you just give us a little bit of a
Well, I
understanding of how you'd work? Like if I were to come to your office and I say I have X problem, what
in
happens?
96, when I really started to work with people one-on-one, I was very green, and I didn't know how to facilitate the acknowledgement of that moment in time. So the beginning of my practice really involved explaining this system to people and telling them what the nature of the conflict was all about and trying to find the time in their lives. And in the case of cancer patients, that is very reassuring, that this is not something that is random, that once you have a cancer diagnosis, it's going to spread like wildfire without rhyme or reason or direction. And, you're just praying for whatever time that you have left on the planet. It's very reassuring for a person to understand that they don't have to die from cancer, that they are literally in control of this. And the worst thing that they can experience after the diagnosis is panic, because it's the panic that is going to facilitate the spreading.
Right.
So
How does cancer spread in the body, by the way? Does
well,
it?
you know, we have
You hear
to
about it, that it
Yeah.
spreads through the body.
Exactly. Well, we hear that a cancer cell is going to discharge itself from a primary tumor somewhere in the body, swim through the bloodstream or the lymphatic system, and then attach itself to another organ and create another cancer. Well, Dr. Hammer refutes that, because now, given what he has found with the behavior of cancer, and not to mention the fact that a shock is responsible for another cancer, he had to examine that very closely. Of course, when someone has a spreading of a cancer, it's not always the same cellular structure. As a matter of fact, it's rare. It's usually a different kind of cellular structure. For example, someone has a lung cancer, right? They will likely develop a bone cancer down the line, or a pleural effusion, which is, you know, fluid around the lungs. Those are all three different cellular structures. That would mean that our bodies had the ability to transform one cellular structure into another cellular structure, which of course it can no longer do after the ovum is fertilized. That's the cutoff point. Once our organs develop, it no longer transforms.
So a bone cancer can't affect my lung, or my thyroid
No.
cancer can't infect my ovaries? That
Exactly.
doesn't work. Okay.
Now, consider that a lung cancer is a cellular structure known as the innermost germ layer that grows during the conflict active phase. A bone cancer is a degenerative process. So how can an adenocarcinoma degenerate the bone? It doesn't. There is no adenocarcinoma cells found in the bones. It's all mesoderm.
Interesting concept.
Yeah.
Interesting indeed.
But you see what Dr. Hammer mentioned to me not long ago, we had a discussion about metastasis. He said, you know, Isadora, if conventional medicine even believed for a moment that a cancer can spread through the bloodstream, he said, when we donate blood, we would have to have a very good, precise screening process in place.
I never thought of that. You're right.
Yes.
We screen the blood for all sorts of
Yes.
things, but
So,
not for cancer, right?
Again, it's a hypothesis. Remember, his research is empirical. He can prove his findings.
So how many patients does he keep track of, or did he keep track of? Like, I understand he does this for many, many decades
yes,
now, right?
To date, it's more than 40,000 patients that he has studied that confirm and reconfirm his findings.
And this is empirical evidence. I guess any
Absolutely.
scientist,
Yeah.
you know,
It
may
could
not
be-
call him a soft scientist if he has the hard data.
But you know what? It
How
can be
is he
proven.
coming along in acceptance in the world that this is a way
He
of
isn't.
dealing with cancer?
He isn't. As you can imagine, his findings threaten everything. It threatens not only traditional medicine, but also alternative medicine, because we base everything on the same philosophy, and that is on the management of symptoms, rather than looking to the actual origin of the problem.
Now, what does it feel like for a human being to, first of all, be confronted with this? You were confronted it. You are a
Yes,
patient,
yes.
quote
Yeah.
unquote.
Yeah.
What did it do to your life once you knew that's what was at the cause of your challenges?
Well,
What changed in your life? And then I want to
Yeah.
talk to you about what is on for the next little while, so people can maybe connect with you, because we are almost out of time. We
Okay.
have 5 minutes or so.
Well, you know, when I embarked in my natural medicine journey, right, we had a way of doing things, right? It was about fasting, it was about cleansing, it was about sprouts, it was about good nutrition, it was about herbs, homeopathy, essential oils, you name it, we did it. We had results, yes, but the results were inconsistent. And that's what my question was really all about. Why do some people recover, and why do some people not recover?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I
You
wondered
see?
that myself. Yeah.
So, when I heard that tape from Dr. Hammer, literally in that 3-hour lecture that he gave in Innsbruck, he answered all my questions. It was at that moment in time that I understood that he literally held the key to why we got ill, and why in some people they became chronically ill.
So what's the difference? Why do some people not heal?
Because they are in what we call a loop, where they have constant tracks reaffecting themselves. They go in and out of conflict, in and out of conflict. This is the basis of all chronic illnesses.
So it's kind of like an addiction.
Well, to a certain degree, it's a subconscious process, because it's the subconscious that rules that mechanism.
Okay.
The subconscious has no idea of time and space. If it receives the trigger or goes back on the track, it's right back to square one where it experienced the shock.
And so the people who succeed, they overcome their triggers?
Or they didn't have many triggers,
Okay.
right? Or they worked with someone in the GNM that understood how to identify this.
So you would help people understand this and help them overcome their triggers?
Yes.
And then once I have that awareness...
Each trigger you find, the moment it's found, it's canceled out. It's no longer a trigger.
Wow. So the minute you know, it's done.
That's it.
There's not a lot of going on a
Right.
treadmill or doing this or doing that.
See, the subconscious is our memory bank, but it also has intellect.
Okay.
So you can appeal to the subconscious just by getting to understand that, wait a minute, this isn't real, this isn't then, this is now. You just went into high alert because you re-experienced something that felt the same.
So nobody needs to go for 6 months to see a certain therapy or a certain modality. It can be done rather quickly. So how often do your patients come and see your clients, if they do come?
You know, I see families now. I've been doing this so long.
Yeah.
But, you know, most of the people that I see on a regular basis also understand the GNM. So for them, it's just a matter of fine-tuning.
Wonderful.
Right.
Well, what is up in the future? Where can people connect with you? Do you have like talks? We know you do online seminars. Please close a little bit off for us with how can people reach you? What's your website? And what events will you be at? Where will you be speaking? That sort of thing. And we, of course, will put your website, both the newmedicine.ca, but then also the GNM online seminars. Is that?
Yes, that's
or
correct.
What else
Yes.
do you need us to know?
Oh, no, that's fine. I do most of my teaching online now. It's accessible worldwide. I have people attending from Australia, China. It's extraordinary. And as long as they speak English, it's fine. They occur once a month for 2 full days. I go through 4 levels, and then the 5th level is a live workshop that they have to come to Toronto, or I go to another country to do that. In those workshops, I teach people how to use the GNM in practice.
So
and
you
their
don't have
practice.
to be like a medical doctor or homeopath to attend your workshops? Anybody can join?
Anybody can join. It involves new terminology, as you can imagine. But at the same time, I always say it's helpful if you have a little basic anatomy and physiology. But I attract more practitioners and medical people in my seminars.
And how can people contact you here in Toronto if somebody is struggling with something? And
Through
they
the
would
website.
Through the website
Yes,
as well?
everything comes to me eventually.
So the newmedicine.ca or through
Both
the
both the GNM, they both have inquiry emails or
Okay.
contact emails. So you can place your inquiry through there.
Well, I thank you so very much, Isidora, for being here with
Thank you.
us. And I'm fascinated by it. Looking forward to
I
the
know how you
opportunity
feel.
to meet you again and, you know, maybe have a workshop here in our facility as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for watching here on thatchannel.com on Liquid Lunch, the 12th of February. Please stay with us and we will be right back.